Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. I'm McKenna from Murder by the Book in Houston, Texas, and I am very excited today to be talking with one of our favorite authors, Martin Walker. He is, of course, the author of the Bruno Chief of Police series, and he's here today to be talking with us about, I can't believe it, number 14 in the series, The Coldest Case. Before I bring him on, I do want to mention we had a busy event week, virtual event week, and we have another one coming up next week. So if you are interested in who else is coming, make sure to check our event calendar at murderbooks.com. We also just updated all of our August events on Facebook today. So the Facebook event calendar is current through August. Lots of great things coming up. We have a ticketed event with Paula Hawkins and Lee Child at the end of the month. Last night, we just did a really fun event with our Penguin Random House sales reps where they were recommending their favorite books of the fall. That can be found here on Facebook or on YouTube as it's just full of recommendations and it's a lot of fun. But now for the star of the show today, let me bring on Martin Walker. Good afternoon or evening to you.
Hello there. How nice to be back in contact, even though it's electronic, Jordan McKenna.
I know. It is a delight. I meant to mention as well that we have signed copies of The Coldest Case, and I've already put a link in the comments if you're interested in ordering those. Those are available, as well as always, put questions in the comments. There's no such thing as a dumb question. If you're on YouTube, you can put that in the live chat, or if you're here on Facebook, you can put them on the comments. I'm going to do your formal introduction real quick, and then I'm going to leave you to talk. So Martin Walker is a senior fellow of the Global Business Policy Council, a private think tank based in Washington, D.C. As I mentioned, he is the author of 14 now Bruno Chief of Police novels, all international bestsellers. He lives in Washington, D.C. and the Dordogne, and he is here today to talk about The Coldest Case. So I'm going to sit back and enjoy your talk and come back in a little bit when we have some questions.
Thank you very much. Well, hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be back on air, at least in Texas. It's a great shame that I can't do my usual book tour and actually say hello to you and press the flesh and meet people. But there we are. We're now living with this COVID. And for me, it's been pretty grim. I had my Christmas with my family in London, and when I was about to fly back to France to take part in a jury on wine, I found that I was testing positive for COVID and had to isolate for 14 days. Thank goodness I had no symptoms, and I was then tested negative. But it's been grim for everybody. I haven't seen Julia, my wife, since January. She hasn't been able to get here to France. It's just been one of those appalling things that's affected so many lives. At least it's given me the time to work away upon not just this novel, but the one for next year, and starting on the one for the year after that. Anyway, since it's evening here in the Perigord in France, I just had an early supper with my neighbors, Raymond and Francette, who play a pretty important part in this book. Raymond is a retired gendarme. He's nearly 80 years old now. He still is a great fan of good food and good wine, and we usually have a little drink together, a little apéro of an evening before dinner. But this evening I had dinner with them, and it was reminded me of how this new novel began, because Raymond traditionally would have a photograph on his refrigerator door of a skull, which was the very first case as a young gendarme detective that he'd ever handled. And it was over 30 years ago now. And what happened was that a body had been found in the woods after a storm. The storm had loosened the earth. Elements, a foot had emerged. A hunter out with a dog. The dog had found the foot. The hunter called the cops. Raymond turned up along with other police people, and they had to try and find out who on earth this body was. And they were never able to do it. Raymond had just completed his forensics course, and so once the body had been removed from the place, he began to dig around in the ground beneath to try and find a bullet. When they had the autopsy, he was looking at all of the ribs to see if there were any signs of a knife wound or whatever. And finally, in desperation, he talked to the juge d'instruction. That's a magistrate, and under French law, magistrates are really the people in charge of an inquiry. And so he asked the magistrate for permission to take off the head of the body and to boil the skull, to remove all of the remaining flesh and decomposition and so on, to see if there was any sign there in the skull of how this guy had died. And you can imagine the scene inside the gendarme headquarters. Raymond set up a stove in the square, in the central square of the headquarters, and set up a mobile stove and began to boil the skull. People at first were interested and then appalled as the stench began to spread. And various people turned up to complain, local shopkeepers, the mayor of the city, then the prefect. The prefect is in France is the representative of the French state, all of them trying to find out what on earth was going on. And Raymond, just as the mayor and the prefect arrive, brings out with a pair of tongs the skull and points it at them and says, "Look, you can see here on this side of the head, you can see the declivity where this man was killed with what looks like a camping tool." And for the next 18 months, Raymond tried to identify who this guy might have been. He knew he was a murder victim, but could never identify him. And that's why the case haunted Raymond. That's why he had the photograph on the fridge door. And then, by complete accident, a couple of years ago, there was a big exposition, a big exhibition at the National Museum of Prehistory in Les Aisies, just down the road from where I'm sitting now. And this is a place I visit very often. It is really the world center of prehistoric studies of Neanderthal and Cro-Magnon people and so on. And this exhibition was really bizarre. Some of you may have seen on the cover of National Geographic 3 years ago a face of an Egyptian pharaoh called Tutankhamen. And that face had been reconstructed from the skull of Tutankhamen by a Frenchwoman, a French artist, who had developed an extraordinary technique of rebuilding the face from the skull's bones. There are, after all, only 43 muscles in the human face, and each of those muscles has to fit into a particular part of the skull, and almost every human skull is a little bit different. And these days, with computer measuring systems, we can work out just how microscopic those changes were. And so this woman, who had not just produced the face of Tutankhamen, was taking some of the skulls from this museum, skulls of Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon people, 50, 60,000 years old for the Neanderthals, 20, 15,000 years old for the Cro-Magnons, and had rebuilt their faces, men, women, and children. And it was remarkable because, I mean, I thought I knew quite a bit about prehistory and so on, but the sudden appearance of recognizable human faces that I'd hitherto just thought of as skulls was quite dramatic for me, and not just for me, but for everybody else who attended this exhibition. And this woman was fascinating, Elizabeth Dayness. She'd begun as a theatre designer, a costume designer, and had developed this technique herself. And with modern computer measurement systems, it's become even more easy for her to do this. And increasingly, she's being used by the police to help with the identification of long dead corpses. But when I saw this exhibition, I thought, if Raymond had had that technology of rebuilding the human face from the skull when he first found this fellow, maybe things would have been different. And of course, all this, when Raymond found this dead body, this was before DNA. So I thought, well, how can I make a story out of this? And I thought, well, okay, we have this 30-year-old body. We managed to get the face recreated, but also DNA analysis upon the skull, what remains of it, were able to show us something. And indeed, in my novel, it gives a link to some family of this person, a family which wasn't altogether clear that there had been a child born to this mother before she got married, which throws up a whole lot of other problems. But then I'm really, I have this sort of this theme going of rediscovering, identifying who this person might have been. And at the same time, I try to bring in some aspects of this local history because here in the Perigord, we are a part of France, which is much older than France. The French state really begins in the 6th century with Clovis, the king of the France. We know that the Perigord culture went back tens of thousands of years before that. If I leave my house and I go in one direction, I will come to a rock shelter called La Ferracie, and that rock shelter contains the world's oldest cemetery. There are 7 bodies there. There's a very old man with a crippled leg. He couldn't have hunted, he couldn't have fed himself. The other people had to take care of him. There were women there buried with pollen around the bones of their necks, which means that they'd been buried with flowers. It was clear that these people had been buried with ritual and respect. This was a human community, perhaps a family, we don't know, but it was 73,000 years old. If I go in another direction, wait for my walk, I will reach the old hilltop town of Limay. And Limay, we know from Julius Caesar's memoirs in Bello Gallico that his legion stormed a hill fort up there that was manned by Gaul warriors. And then he, Julius Caesar, built an oppidum, a Roman fortress and town. The Middle Ages, again, they built castles up there on that hill because this hill overlooked the meeting point of 2 rivers, the Vézère River and the Dordogne River. And that meant it was a perfect place to tax trade because in those days, roads were terrible. If you could, you did movement of goods by water. And where you had rivers coming together was a perfect place for taxes to take place. So I got to know this area around Limay quite well, and I became staggered by something, which was the archaeologists had found in Limay a number of several hundred flat stones about the size of my 2 hands together. And on those stones were engraved either a bull, a deer, a horse, or a mammoth. And some of the legs and trunks and tails had been sort of scratched out and redrawn. The only explanation the archaeologists could come up with for this extraordinary cache of these stones was that it had been the world's first art school some 13,000 years ago. This sense of history is terribly important, terribly powerful here in the Perigord, not just for me as a visitor, but for the people who actually live here. And many of them still talk the old original language called Occitan, which is very like the language of Catalonia. And indeed, it's a language which the French Republic tried to suppress without very much success. And so there is this local culture, this local history, this local cuisine, this sense of being somewhere not entirely France or France, but something extra, which is very powerful here. One of the symbols of that is an annual festival called the Félibré. And the Félibré, it's an Occitan term for a festival, takes place in a different town in this region every year, every summer. And the entire town is, for a whole week, is en fête, is having a great big street party, and people get dressed up in the old traditional costumes. They put on concerts of traditional troubadour music and so on, and of course they cook and cook and prepare more and more meals and serve more and more wine in the classic Perigord way. And so I wanted to bring this in as well and to point out, well, perhaps this guy, this mysterious dead body, when he'd been killed, it was during a Félibré. And from then, things start to fall into place. And it brings in something else as well. Before I began writing these novels, I was a journalist for the British newspaper, The Guardian. I was a foreign correspondent. I worked in the Middle East, in Africa, in South America, Asia, around the world. But I spent most of the 1980s in Moscow as the Guardian's bureau chief. And that was the time of Mikhail Gorbachev and this sort of revolution that finished up by dismantling the Soviet Union. And I became fascinated by this. And then I was moved to become bureau chief in Washington, D.C., with when President George Bush, the elder, was in the White House. And I had a ringside seat, really, at the closing phase of the Cold War. And so I wrote a history book just called The Cold War, A History. It was the first single volume history of the Cold War. And because of that, I was able to bring in other aspects of this period 30 odd years ago, starting with an extraordinary achievement by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. In the weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the CIA managed to get hold of somehow, it's still not clear, somehow they got hold of the entire file of all of the agents of the Stasi, that's the East German Security Service. Whether they were foreigners, whether they were West Germans, East Germans, it was all contained on nearly 200 CDs. Somehow the CIA got hold of it. Some say they bought it for $75,000, in which case it was the best bargain since they bought Manhattan from the local Native Americans. Others say that some East German high-ups bought immunity by handing this over to the CIA. But the fact is, the CIA had this master file of all of the Stasi agents all over the world. And they shared this with several of their allies and friends. They shared it with the British, with the Germans, some Scandinavians, the Dutch. They never shared it with the French because there's been a lot of bad blood between French and American intelligence since the days of Charles de Gaulle back in World War II. And indeed, back in 1961, something bizarre took place. President Jack Kennedy wrote a personal letter to Charles de Gaulle in Paris saying, "We have unimpeachable evidence that somebody in your immediate circle is working for the KGB. And we want to be able to show you the evidence." They'd got this from a defector, from a Soviet defector. And the French sent over a team of interrogators who tried to sort of work out whether this guy was telling the truth or not. They could never fault him. They tried putting some false documents in front of him, and he said, "No, I never saw those." They sent some real documents in front of him. "Oh, yes, these crossed my desk." The guy passed every test. But nonetheless, the French refused to believe it. And then the guy who was the chief liaison in Washington for French intelligence with the Americans decided that he was in real trouble back in Paris, and that people in Paris wanted to get rid of him. They thought he'd become too close to the Americans. He was ordered to go home. He applied to the Americans for asylum. And for the first time in history, the only time, the chief intelligence agent of a friendly allied state was granted asylum in the USA. So how could I not bring in something as dynamic, as dramatic as this into the novel? And how could I not try and link this particular corpse to what had taken place in that momentous time some 31 years ago when the Berlin Wall came down, the Soviet Empire began to crumble, and our new world, our post-Cold War world began to emerge. So I had enormous fun, in a way, writing this novel, because I was able to bring in my current fascination and love for the Perigord and its history, its culture, and of course its food and its wine, along with my own history, my personal involvement in these days of the Cold War. And when I talk about wine, I should add something. I'm now making my own wine, and it's called Cuvée Bruno. And those of you who know the Bruno novels might recognize this basset hound. This basset hound is my own dog, who's called Balzac, and he appears often in the novels. And Balzac is wearing a policeman's képi. This is the Cuvée Bruno for the year 2018. It's the best of the wines that I've made with my friends. And so, from the Perigord, cheers to you all, and I hope you get to enjoy Cuvée Bruno at some point. Wine here is not just part of the culture, it's of great economic importance to people, but it's also something more than that. In every part of France, whether in Burgundy, in the Loire, in Bordeaux, down up in the Limousin, or down in the Provence, every region is proud of its own wines, and in a sense helps define itself by its own wines. And one of the things about this wine that I make is that it's a fairly standard blend of the kind that you will find in Bordeaux and the Bergerac. It's mainly Merlot. It's about 60% Merlot, with about 25% Cabernet Sauvignon, and about 8% Cabernet Franc. And the rest is a rather less common grape called Malbec, or as we call it, Cote. That's the old name for it here. And the reason I wanted to put that grape in was because in the year 1152, when Eleanor of Aquitaine married King Henry II of England and began the 300 years of English control of this region, the wine that they served at her wedding was Malbec or Cote. And so for that historical reason, I've always wanted to have a little bit of Malbec in my wine, just so I can sort of tip my glass and tip my hat to this most extraordinary woman in history, Eleanor of Aquitaine, the only woman ever married to both the King of France and to a King of England, the only queen, reigning queen, who ever went to Jerusalem with the Crusaders back in the 11th century. She was the mother of Richard Lionheart, this warrior king of England. When he was off on crusade and when he was imprisoned by the Austrians after being shipwrecked, it was his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who actually ran England and ran half of France. Probably the most extraordinary woman in history. And so each time I drink a glass of my wine, I tip my hat to Eleanor of Aquitaine and this extraordinary history of this part of the world, which I'm lucky enough to have discovered. Or at least I didn't quite discover it. I had some French friends, Gabrielle, who is now my translator from English into French, and her husband Michel, another journalist, and he and I had known each other in the Middle East and worked together. And he and I met our wives at about the same time, had our first children at about the same time, and then Gabrielle, his wife, inherited a place near here from her grandfather. And they decided to move to France from London, where they were then working. And so Julia and I would go and visit them. And on the first visit, Michel and I were building his terrace outside of his farmhouse and scrawling our names into the wet cement as Julia and Gabrielle were cooking up wonderful foods, and our daughters, Kate and theirs, Olivia, were sort of rolling naked around the grass in the garden. And while we were in Moscow, the story for a journalist was great, but the food was unspeakable. So the chance to go and stay with our friends in the Perigord for a couple of weeks every summer was really very enticing. And then Julia at one point said to my wife, Julia said to me at one point, we're footloose foreign correspondents. We really need a place that's home, roots for the children to understand. And I thought, yeah, a very good idea. I heard no more. And then Julia and our children were staying with our friends in the Perigord. I was in Washington, where I had an interview in the White House with Bill Clinton, who was then president. And I'd known Clinton since we were together at Oxford back in the late 60s and the beginning of the 70s. And I'm about to go into the Oval Office. I'm standing in the anteroom, and my home, my telephone rings, my mobile. Now, in those days, mobiles were like bricks, you might recall. And it was Julia saying, I don't care what you're doing. Drop everything and catch the next plane to France. I've found our house. This point, I wasn't actually sure we were looking for a house, but there we were. She'd found it. I explained Clinton White House interview, but after a couple of days, I was on a plane and here we are. This is the house that she found. We've been here now for what, 22, 23 years. And at first, it was like a holiday home, but now it is a home and it's transformed my life. Never did I think I would become a gardener. Never did I think I'd start raising my own chickens and pheasants. And anyway, there we are. Things change. And Julia also had two other very important roles to play. One of which was she's always been the first reader of all of my books. And one of them, when she read the first manuscript of the first Bruno, she said, She said, I think you've got something here, but you can't call him after your friend Pierrot, the local policeman. He needs an international name. Call him Bruno. So I called him Bruno. And she said, wow, now this is all right, but publishers really like to think they have a series coming. So go away and write 5 paragraphs, 1 paragraph on each of the next 5 Brunos you intend to write. Yes, ma'am, I said. I went away and did this. A couple of months later, my agent came back and said, yes, we've sold the series in England, Germany, America, Holland, Sweden, and so on. And we're now in 18 languages around the world, which is extraordinary to me. And it's extraordinary also to a man called Pierrot, who really inspired much of this. Pierrot was a guy I met at the local tennis club here in my village in the Perigord, and he was 10 years in the French army. He's a very good cook, a keen hunter. Spends his spare time teaching the local kids to play rugby or tennis, and one of his rugby pupils, a girl from our girls team, has just won a silver medal in Tokyo when the French rugby sevens team got into the final against New Zealand. And our little Carla Nyson, who I've known since she was yay high, has got a silver medal. We can't wait to welcome her back. Anyway, this guy, Pierrot, who'd trained her, who'd been her teacher of rugby, he was our village policeman. And he was the guy who, in a sense, gave me the idea of writing about this French country village policeman who became Bruno. And it's been an extraordinary journey these last 14 years and 14 Bruno novels. And it's not over. And Julia has another role to play because a few years ago in the German readers were so keen about the food in the Bruno novels, they asked us to start producing a Bruno cookbook, which we did. Bruno's Cookbook, it was called. And it won a prize from Gourmand International as the world's best French cookbook of the year. So then we had to do another one, Bruno's Garden Cookbook, and that also won a prize. So now next year, the Bruno Cookbook will be coming out in England by me and by my wife of 43 years, Julia. One final thing about my wife. She's an extraordinary woman and very beautiful, and I'm still absolutely passionate about her. But some years ago, our 2 children were with us here in the Perigord one summer, and over a bottle of wine, the younger one, Fanny, who now lives in Seattle, said, Dad, we all know that your character, Bruno, has got a real life inspiration in your friend Pierrot. I think, she went on, I think there is somebody else in your novels who has a real life model. Oh, yes, I said, who is that? She said, well, there were these women in Bruno's life. And there's Isabel, the policewoman whom he fell in love with first. And then there is this woman, Pamela, this Scotswoman, whom he gets to know later. And Fanny said, Pamela is a Scot. Mummy is a Scot. Pamela rides horses. Mummy rides horses. Pamela is a great cook. Mummy is a great cook. Pamela has red hair. And Mummy this year has red hair. And I was not about to say anything, but then Julia burst in and said, "No, Fanny, no, no, darling, you're quite wrong." He said, "I am no way am I the model for Pamela, but perhaps for Isabel," she said. And after many, many years of marriage, I'd learned enough to keep silent. And I will never, ever comment upon whether Julia is a model for anybody. I really don't think I could ever bring my wife to life in a novel. It would be far too daunting. But of all the fun that I have writing these Bruno books and of living in the Perigord, one part of it is that I can try and create characters. Most of the men characters come from a particular model. The dog, Bruno's Balzac, Bruno's Basset Hounds, always come from our own Basset Hounds. But the women, never. The women can never come from somebody I know. The women just have to come from my own imagination, for better or for worse. But whatever it is, I enjoy doing these books, and I'm so glad that so many people around the world enjoy reading them. So here is to your very good health, and thank you for Murder by the Book, my favorite Texas bookstore, indeed one of my favorites in the world. I'm so sorry I'm not there with you all, but I hope next year we'll be traveling again. So, cheers.
Cheers to you as well. And that was a wonderful talk. I just sat back and enjoyed and listened, and what a treat. We have a quiet crowd. We have no questions. So I think that you have covered all the things. Also, we've done a few of these talks virtually now. So maybe the regular watchers have already asked their questions. So I'm saying we can call it a good evening if that works for you. No one wants to pick up with something else.
I barely got started. I mean, one of the things about this COVID is that it's given me time to do quite a lot more writing, and so as well as the cookbook coming out next year in English, there's going to be a collection of Bruno short stories coming out.
Oh, wonderful.
And I had to write most of them just from scratch recently in the course of the last few months. When one of them you might be interested in, particularly, it's called Birth Neanderthal, because I had this idea of, could you make cave people's cooking, Neanderthal cooking, could you make that in a way that was sort of acceptable to the modern palate? I mean, we know that they would hunt down mammoths and horses and deer and so on. But I mean, did they have any other way to prepare it other than frying it or putting it over a stove on a kind of a barbecue? Or did they eat anything else? Did they have any fruit and vegetables? So I was always interested in this, and I went around to the local museum, the Museum of Prehistory, and began talking to the experts. And it turns out that this is now becoming a whole new field of research. And I was getting in there talking to people who were starting this off. So we began by trying to recreate a Neanderthal oven. And we dug a hole in a patch of clay by a riverbank and smoothed it all out and dampened it down. We built a fire at the bottom of this hole, and so that dried out the actual walls of it. Then we filled in the cracks, put another fire in there, and then we put in meat wrapped in leaves. And I collected a lot of wild garlic leaves to go with this, and we covered up and we let it cook in there in the up. It worked. Would you believe it worked?
Wow.
And then we tried boiling stuff in there as well. Then I was reading, I got a lot of readers in Germany, and I've got to know a lot of people in Germany. And one of them is a real fan, and he is a professor of food science. And one of the things he was fascinated about was what kind of vegetables Neanderthal prehistoric people would eat. And he'd done a lot of research down on the shores of the Mediterranean, of the North Sea, and of the Atlantic coast. And he had found in seaweeds and various duckweeds and so on, he had found tiny, tiny little snails, really minute. And he then found that there were fossils of these snails that had been found in the dust heaps, in the rubbish heaps of prehistoric people. And so he was able to show that they had been eating these sorts of duckweeds. So I went out to collect duckweed and we began trying to prepare the duckweed. And what I did, again, wild garlic, because that grows quite naturally here, wild garlic and mushrooms, which also grow naturally, we mixed it all in together and we steamed it. And it, it was it was not exactly tasty, but we could swallow it.
Yeah.
So we began to realize that there is an awful lot going on here. Then another guy who was at the British Museum in London, who was on a similar kind of kick, he had been working on trying to find particular kinds of plants that grow in marshes that he reckoned were also edible in prehistoric times as well. So I put all of this stuff together and I wrote this short story on Birth Neanderthal with Bruno creating a 3-course meal that Neanderthals could have
That's
enjoyed.
great.
I just love this stuff. I really do. And the reason I love it is that you probably know that before I began writing the Bruno books, my first novel was called The Caves of Perigord,
Yeah.
which is still my wife's favorite. And this was because when we first began living here, I was completely fascinated by the caves, the painted caves, these places like Lascaux, Combarel, Fond de Gaume, but these places where you see 20,000, 30,000 years old people creating art for the first time, if you like.
Right.
And I would visit them regularly. I went to interview archaeologists and artists, trying to understand what kind of society could have produced this. And nobody knows, really. Nobody knows much about the human society at that time. So I decided to try and invent it myself. And I wrote this novel, The Caves of Perigord. But I realized that it wasn't enough just to write about the cave artists and how they developed this extraordinary technique that they had, not just of, I mean, they were scientific about this. The reason why they have colors, for example, the reds in the walls, is because they'd learned to use the iron oxide in the clay. And they'd burn it and make it all crumbly and then make a paint out of it. For the black colors, they would use manganese clay as well. They really understood something of this early chemistry. Even better, these caves deep underground are completely lined in white chalk. How on earth could they have had light to paint by that didn't have, that they had torches that had been black smoke covering all of this wonderful white chalk? How would they do it? They developed the only technology that worked. They found that if you used, they developed a stone kind of lamp into which they put rendered reindeer fat, and they used a juniper twig as a wick. And
Wow.
that gives a clear, white, smokeless light. It was the only way they could have done this.
Amazing.
This is 18,000 years ago. I mean, it's remarkable. So I was just fascinated by all of this. And I was fascinated also to learn that when Picasso went down there shortly after the place was rediscovered, he came out saying, "We have learnt nothing in all of these thousands of years. These people are our masters." And yes, they are. It's an extraordinary thing to see this. But then I realized when I was writing this that I needed another kind of time sequence as well to put it all into perspective. And at this time, this was back in the late 1990s, and I realized that most of the old resistance fighters were dying off. So I made a point of going around interviewing as many of them as I could. Like René Coustellier, who was the head of the Soleil network, one of the most important ones. And I just tried to understand from them what it was like to be in the resistance in 1944, in the summer of D-Day. And of course, at a time when many of them in this area were hiding inside the caves and were storing their weapons inside the caves. And the more I began to look at this, the more I realized that there is an extraordinary, almost untold history of World War II. When the D-Day planners were preparing for the invasion of Normandy in June of 1944, back in the springtime, there was one German military unit that really, really worried them. It was called the 2nd SS Division Das Reich. It was an armored division, but being SS, it was twice the size of a normal division. It was, instead of 10,000 men, it was 23,000 men. Now, this division had been chewed up a bit in the fighting in the summer of 43 on the Eastern Front in Russia. It was sent back to re-equip and to refit and to bulk up with new recruits and new soldiers over the winter of 43-44. By February, March of 1944, this was by far the strongest military unit in the whole of Western Europe. It was re-equipped with Panther tanks, with Sturmgewehr assault guns, highly trained 23,000 SS troops. And normally, in normal times, that division would have got from Montauban, near Toulouse, up to Normandy in about 3 days. And so the planners in London sent messages to the resistance here saying, whatever it costs, whatever it takes, slow these guys down. We can't afford to have them coming to Normandy when we're still getting onto the beaches. And so at every crossing across the River Dordogne, the Vézère, small groups of resistance fighters would gain an hour or two, maybe 3 hours. Montdidier, they gained a whole day. But yet this, how to stop an armored division, it's almost impossible. And so they began to commit atrocities against German troops that they captured, hoping that the Germans would retaliate. And they did. In Toul, just up the river, the Germans hanged 100 people from a local lamppost. At Ruffignac, 10 minutes from my house, they burned the entire town down. Montdidier, on the way to Bergerac, they flattened the town with artillery. It was merciless, but every time they did this, they lost time. They lost days. And the worst of all, a place called Oradour-sur-Glane, just over the border into the Limousin here. They put 630 women and children into a church and burned them alive. And that cost them a day and a half to do that. The fact is that armored division did not finally arrive in Normandy for 3 weeks. Every day of delay was crucial for the D-Day landings, but equally, every day of delay was bought with French lives. Yeah. And so I wanted to bring this aspect in of the history as well. Once I knew about it, with my researches here, I'd begun to realize just how important this was. And so that was, in a sense, that is this extraordinary affection I've developed for the Perigord, not just for the people, but for the prehistory, the medieval history, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and also for my neighbors, the old men who did this kind of thing, almost within living memory. And I just take my hat off to them, not just for that, but for the wonderful food they've created. I mean, this is the gastronomic heartland of France. And of course, for what I've learned about wine. So God bless them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have one quick question, and then we're going to sign off for the afternoon. Tony was wondering, is there any possibility of Bruno coming to a TV streaming series similar to the German series in the future?
Yes, there is. The film rights have been, or the TV series rights have been bought by a German company, UFA Film Studios, which is owned by Bertelsmann, who also own Penguin Random House these days. And they've got a deal with French TV, Austrian, Swiss TV. And so I was assuming that this was going to be filmed in German and dubbed into French. But since quite recently, I can't specify, but a major American group that's into streaming is now part of the discussions.
Wonderful.
So it might even be filmed in English.
Yeah.
I will keep you posted. I will let you know as soon as I do. But frankly, I mean, I let my agent handle this
Yeah.
stuff. I mean,
Yeah.
business
Of
is not
course.
really my thing.
Of course.
Okay.
Okay, that's the questions. It's always lovely to chat with you. Have a wonderful evening. As I mentioned, we have signed copies of the new book available. There's a link in the comments.
Great.
And thanks to everyone watching. Martin, as always, it's been a delight.
And
Bye.
thanks to you. And I love the new hairstyle.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Ciao.